How we doing?
Elliot.
Awesome.
Doing great.
Glad to see everyone can make it today. We're here obviously for the event Making CRO. Today's event is brought to you by the team here at Modern Sales Pros. For everyone who's not familiar, Modern Sales Pros is the world's largest and highest quality community for those in sales management, sales leadership, sales and revenue operations, and sales enablement, aka our Modern Sales Pros. Our mission is to create an environment for our members to answer questions they'd struggle to solve on their own and help them see around corners they may not know about. We do that through live sessions like this, an online forum, and our quarterly summits. If you're already not a part of the community, you're going to be invited to join after this event. And before we dive into the content, just going to go over some quick housekeeping notes. First of all, this event is being recorded. You're going to be able to access the recording and key takeaways of this event on the previous events page. Second, if there's any questions for our speakers today, please do use the Q&A function or the chat, and they're going to do their best to get to them during the session. Sweet. So now we can kick things off. Pete, I'm going to pass it over to you to do some introductions here.
Sweet. Thank you very much, Elliot. I'm really excited to have such an august slate of worthies here to be sharing insights with our audience here. My name is Vika Zanji. I'm one of the founders of Atrium. For those who don't know, Atrium makes data-driven sales management software. That helps sales organizations improve rep performance through the smart use of data. So that's what we spend our time doing. For folks who are joining us here today, we actually have two offers we'd like to offer folks for the CROs and the VPs of Sales, the second level leaders in the house. We actually have a bunch of sweet Atrium Yeti coolers that we're actually giving way to folks who are down to take a discovery call with our staff. And then don't worry if you are not quite in second level leader land yet, we have a wonderful offer for you of a Coffees for Closers Yeti mug and a set of awesome sales management books here. So Elliot's going to go ahead and drop the links for that in the chat. So go ahead and sign up as you see fit, which for the one that applies to you. For folks who don't know me, like I noted earlier, I'm one of the founders of Atrium. I also started Modern Sales Pros about 6 years ago. Prior to that, I started a recruiting software company called TalentBin back in like 2010 that was acquired by Monster Worldwide in 2014. And that's really where I went from being kind of a business generalist founder to a first seller, then a sales leader. And then eventually, after that acquisition, wrote a book on startup sales called Founding Sales, which some of you may have heard of. So that's a little bit on me. But more importantly, we have our wonderful slate of CROs here. Dylan, we can start with you. Maybe you can share a little bit with folks around what VIA does, where you were before, and kind of what you spend your time doing. And then we'll move on to Leandra and then Mike.
Great. Thanks, Pete. Dylan Twombly, I'm the Chief Revenue Officer here at VIA. We're the world's leader in transportation technology. We're in about 700 cities in 40 countries, and I've been here for about 5 years. We started as a direct-to-consumer platform similar to Uber and Lyft, with the default being a shared ride, and then branched out to provide this technology to cities and transit agencies. And I came on to sort of help build out what we call the SaaS side of the business, which is now our primary focus. Before this, I was at a company called Dataminer and built out corporate sales there, and I've been here for about 5 years and based in Brooklyn. Thanks for having me.
I feel that somebody needs to write up the canonical list and stories of all the B2C pivots to be to B2B. I think it would be Slack is one, etc. I think that would be amazing. Leander, I know that you are just new in seat over there at Apollo IO. Maybe you can share with folks, for folks who've been hiding under a rock and don't know what Apollo IO is, maybe share a little bit with folks on what that is, and then also a little bit on what you spend your time doing and maybe some of the roles that you've had before.
Thanks so much, Pete. I appreciate being here with this esteemed panel today to chat a little bit about life making a CRO. Yes, I've been at Apollo now 6 weeks. Apollo is a data and sales intelligence platform, and excited to now be selling to my tribe, a tribe of salespeople, sales leaders, sales managers out there in the world, giving back for my 32 years that I've spent in the trenches of sales. Started at the bottom, worked my way up, most recently at previously was at Intercom, which is an amazing, fun ride. Prior to that, at Twilio and SendGrid. So deep in the PLG motion, passionate about how you take that and evolve it to that sales upmarket motion as well. And excited to be here today.
We will have to get drinks to talk about selling to sellers and selling to sellers, but also selling to sellers and also selling to sales operations while at the same time that you're selling to sellers. It's a fun two-legged sales motion there. And then last but not least, Mr. Mike Head here, CRO of impact.com. Mike, maybe you can share with folks what impact.com does and what you spend your time doing there.
Sure. So impact.com helps businesses scale through partnerships. That's affiliates, influencers, content sites, etc. We all know getting to our prospects and our customers has become increasingly hard. And so use authenticity and trust that you have with your partners to be able to reach them faster. I'm on the opposite side of Leandra. I've been with impact.com for 12 years. I started as employee number 10. I was our second AE. I've held over 10 roles with the organization, including sales engineer, VP of sales, a GM of a product line, and now CRO.
I love it. So you know where all the bodies are buried.
I have used that line before. And quick plug for your swag. Big fan of this book. It's something I learned a lot from.
You're supposed to hold up my book, man, not John McMahon. Not John McMahon. Let's see. John McMahon, Pete Kazanji. Come on, man.
I mean, you're pretty close. Pretty close.
Right. He's got way better hair and way better outcomes. Okay, cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about so as I noted before, I was spinning through with Elliot the RSVP list earlier. We got some really awesome like sales managers, second level sales leaders, sales operations folks, et cetera. Essentially folks who are probably like looking out 10 years in the future, 20 years in the future, 30 years in the future, and saying like, hey, how do I end up being in charge of like all of revenue, right? And how is that different than what I'm doing right now? Like, how can I set myself up for that? And then also they're probably thinking about like, hey, what are ways that we can kind of talk about like, do the job you want to have before you do it, right? Sort of thing, kind of like dress for the job you want, like do the job that you want before you get promoted into it. And so I think that there's probably an opportunity for you guys to hip folks around how you think about sales leadership or revenue leadership and some of the intricacies once you start getting into like, third level, fourth level leadership there. So that's essentially what we're going to talk about today. And I think we just want to be as tactical as possible for folks. So if folks walk out of here with like 2 or 3 kind of like meaty tidbits that they can immediately apply, then I think that would be a success. So I think one thing that we talk about quite a bit here at Atrium is the manager mindset, and specifically because like Atrium is primarily used by first line managers, SDR managers, AE managers, et cetera. Oftentimes the way that our customer success organization really has to hip people to the notion of like, hey, like you're not a super rep anymore. Like you're not here to do the job yourself. Like you are a manager, you have to work through your reps. And it's kind of can be a little bit of a, like a brain twist for folks. Okay, well now when you go from manager to second level manager, right? Or like, even further up, it's kind of like a similar like brain twist there. And so, yeah, I thought what we could do is like maybe start with a couple like kind of takeaways on like, how that mindset shifts from when you're being a first level leader to being a second level leader or like a third level leader, et cetera. And Leandra, maybe we can start with you because you have the best art.
Well, thank you. Hats off to the Oakland art galleries here. But I really feel like the big shift for me when I was going through that process is just really understanding you've got to switch from tactical to strategic, and you've got to look at the business at a different altitude. And when you're that frontline manager, you're in it. You're in it with your reps. You're in it with those customers. You're focusing on just a lot of different, kind of reactive things. And as you move up the ladder, you really need to be more proactive and thinking more about the strategy and how do you really look at driving revenue in a different way. And you're going from kind of that coaching mindset to a little bit more of the empowering and enabling and delegation, because I think we're all, if we've carried a bag, we're used to doing it ourselves. And as you move up the layers, you've got to make sure that you are communicating well, that you are delegating well, that you're making sure that your leaders have what they need in order to be successful, so you can drive more strategy at the top on how you get to focus on the fun things like growth strategies and retention strategies and expansion.
Nice. Michael, what would you say is something that that folks should be thinking about when they're, kind of the mindset transition from first level manager to second and beyond?
Yeah, so I echo many of the points. Being the first AE and so focused on individual deals and preparation and everything you needed to do to be successful for a single pitch. I also needed to really elevate my thinking and make sure that I was staying out of the weeds and not getting pulled into it. One other thing that I'll add to it that is really, I've shifted in my mindset is not reacting to stories. Right. And so there's a lot of stories that happen within the field, and it's easy to over index and feel like that's actually a pattern or a trend, and pulling myself back and saying, wait, let me see what the data actually shows me so that I can understand if this is something we need to address or not.
I love that. I remember when so I come from a product management and a product marketing background at this point, like 15 years ago. So I guess I am actually like a sales leader now, even though and I just remember when my company was acquired by Monster, we had done a pretty good job of becoming a very heavily data-driven sales organization at Talent Bin, mainly because I didn't know any better. And I was like, oh, this is a factory. Of course we would instrument inputs and intermediaries and outputs. Great. Like one of my favorite books is The Goal, one of my favorite business books. And then when we got bought by Monster, it was so funny to hear all the sales leaders be like, I'm hearing. I hear that a lot. I'm hearing da da da, and I was like, what? I was like, but look at the win rate, or but look at the ASP, or look how many look how many overlay requests we're having. It's like, yeah, I'm hearing X Y Z, and so I think that was my kind of first introduction to the management by anecdata, and kind of the old school mindset. Dylan, what do you have to add in terms of the changing mindset of getting out of the first level manager mindset into the second and third level manager mindset?
Yeah, I really like both Michael and Leandra's comments. I think the recency bias, particularly for sales leadership or execs at the company, you go into the field, you're in front of the partner, you feel like this is a huge issue that you need to get on top of, and you're with your first and second level leadership or sales reps there, and you want to go solve this problem. You got to come back and sort of double click on the data. I think it's a big one. The only other thing I would sort of add to Leandra's point on the enablement, which I really like that sort of as a focus for management, is I think also as a more senior leader in the company, your goal can't just be sort of enablement of the sales team. It's got to be what's going to get you more velocity across that process. So is it solutions engineering? Is it the launch team? You've got to have a little more expansive view. And I think that's tough at the beginning, particularly if you're very focused on the deals for your team, but that may not be where you can drive actually the most value. And so keeping a little bit of a broad perspective helps.
Yeah. Let's kind of index off of that, because it's funny, you guys know this, but I will define it for our audience, because oftentimes people are like, well, what is a CRO? We actually, when we do persona training here at Atrium, it's just like, oh, well, that's just a very fancy title for a sales manager, right? It's like, no, bro. Well, some organizations, maybe it is. Right? The CRO of the Series Seed startup with 3 reps. Got it. But the traditional definition of a chief revenue officer is someone who has responsibility for all the parts of the revenue lifecycle, which is kind of what Dylan was referring to there. So the traditional definition of that is that marketing is in there, sales is in there, and then also success is in there as well, because they, from lead to cash to renew, it's all it's all in there. And so if you're the CRO now, you can't have we love all our children equally, right? Not just the AEs, and if they're taking on the new business, the new business logos. And I think that Dylan just kind of points that out. What so if historically, and I think a lot of CROs typically come out of sales versus there's some marketing, like I think Sterling, I forget Sterling's last name, at Divvy was came out of marketing and did a CRO, but like traditionally kind of comes out of sales. And so now all of a sudden you're coming from an AE background or what have you, or a closing background or what have you, but now you're responsible for like quantity and quality of leads, and then also quantity and quality of NRR and things like that. How do you maybe Dylan, we can kind of start with you, because you're referring to this as with respect to enablement. How does that change the way that you are, just leading your department versus now all of a sudden you're responsible for the upstream thing and the downstream thing of your department as well? Is that your historical department?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. I think it also depends a lot if you're coming in and building it from scratch, or if you're taking over sort of a more mature organization. I think if it's the former, like if you're coming in new and having to build this, customer success tends to be a little bit of an afterthought, which is a huge mistake. I think in every case, it's probably the most under-resourced. And at some point down the line, that's where not all, but a lot of the majority of your revenue growth is probably going to come from upsell and cross-sell to existing customers versus new business. If you've been able to scale pretty quickly, this is a transition, we've sort of gone through here over the past couple of years. On that front, I think the two mistakes people make are not hiring a sales ops leader that is like excellent and can help you for the next couple of years. I think that tends to be under-resourced. And I think customer success too. It tends to be a little bit of an afterthought at the beginning, and then you reach this inflection point where you sort of like, oops. I think for existing organizations, the split is a little easier because you can be a little more data-driven. You're going to come in and you may not see that sort of wave of customer growth versus sales. You're already in it, right? So you can get a sense of where your biggest problems are, whether it's churn or what your upsell rates look like, and sort of what percentage is coming from new versus existing customers. But I think being data driven when you're coming into an existing place is really important, so that you don't come in with your biases. And I think at least my experience, when you're building, like having a good customer success and a good sales ops leader is key.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, because a lot of, and I think Leander kind of noted this earlier, it's like thinking more like a business owner versus like a business, like you're in this function. And so then you would say, oh, okay, well, like what drives revenue for the organization? If you're a large organization, it's going to be all your renewals. Right? Like this is something that, and I think that small organizations, and you can totally understand why people are like so focused on like closing a new logo acquisition, because if you don't do that, you never get to be a large organization. But once you are a larger organization, it's like the thing that's going to sustain you and like is your revenue base is not, it's not the fighter jocks in new biz, right? It's it's the AMs and the CSMs. And I think a lot of folks kind of miss out on that, because we really glorify, again, because you don't get to that fancier state if you didn't get through here. So it's kind of like, of course, we had to, we had to be really focused on that, but then you don't like miss out on the fact. So I think that's a really key thing. And I think that's a good. So Dylan mentioned the thing about sales ops, and of course, my joke is that, and I'm good friends with Leander as head of revenue operations over there at Apollo. Revenue operations is just just a way of saying sales operations with more syllables, but it's actually not true, because it's like essentially where somebody like is responsible and thinking about the smoothness and removing friction from the entire revenue life cycle. So having like a really good partner that is going to help you debug and then like honey badger where the constraints are. Leander, when you think about because I think you come from were you the CRO at Intercom as well? I
Yes.
did a bad job on pre-call planning.
Yeah.
I'm fired.
Yep.
So when you think about, going from sales to CRO, what was the mindset shift there when all of a sudden now you're responsible for marketing and also success as well, especially with Intercom, like a bajillion smaller ASP customers, like a ton, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to have a one team mindset, and you've got to really focus on the customer journey. And I think it's easy to get into these silos of departments to be like, well, this is my job. And I would always ask my team, are you building bridges or burning them? Because I've been in many organizations where you walk in and it's been like a firestorm. And so we want to make sure that we're connecting all of those pieces, focusing around the customer journey. So every aspect of that customer experience, from that first awareness all the way through to adoption and advocacy, that has to be handed off by every single department to ensure that customer focus. And it really does take a village. You have to have that mindset to say it's not just what I do, or it's not us against them. When you think about your cross department, I always say, who's your cross department bestie, and how do we ensure that the customer experience is great, so we can make sure that ultimately we're doing the right thing for the customer and the company.
I think that's so. And did you say one team, or did you say team one? I
One
think
team. Yeah.
one team. Yeah. You guys have probably read Five Dysfunctions of a Team, right?
Yeah.
So Kyle Porter had me read that like 3 years ago, and because he's just like, what's the person's name? Patrick Lencioni, I want to
Yeah.
say. Kyle is just like the biggest Patrick Lencioni like homer in the world, but I think it's like really good, and it's just like flipping that bit. So in that book, I highly recommend it to folks. In that book, there's a CEO who's coming in and like dealing with a bunch of dysfunction in a executive team. In this case, it's the C-suite versus like the CRO, of course, but like it goes all the way down, right? Like if the CRO is responsible for the VP of Sales, VP of Marketing, VP of Success, you potentially have the same thing, which is people who are kind of like being territorial, like red team, blue team sort of thing. Like, oh, well, the reason why we're not hitting our number is because, like we're not getting qualified leads from, from marketing. It's all just like, crap MQLs. And of course, that's the worst possible situation, right? Versus one team mindset, which is, hey, like everyone is contingent on each other for success. And I really like the cross departmental bestie there. It seems like that seems like that could be a like really good takeaway right now. It's like, hey, if you're a director of sales or what have you, do you have like a good strong relationship with somebody who's like, in CS? Do you have a strong relationship with maybe a marketing manager who does programs or what have you in marketing, to at least like give you an inside baseball and some more kind of empathy there? Mike, what would you have to add on this front, given the fact that you have gone all the way around, like, and done solutions engineering and janitorial and so on and so forth, right?
You know it. Yeah, a couple of things. So I think on the Patrick Lencioni, the interesting thing for me was not thinking about, my department as my team, but the executive leadership as my team and having their back. I thought that was a really good concept and a fundamental change for me. For me,
Totally.
going up through the organization, there were a couple things that I would talk about. So one was my personal brand, right? My brand was initially really known as a sales guy and a salesperson, right? And so as I started to take over more departments, I needed to be aware that that was what people were expecting of me, that a
Sure.
bias around that. And so I came in with a mentality of the only thing I know is that I know nothing. Right. And so just tried to be very humble and get a better understanding and really learn from the other leaders and other departments so that, as Dylan said, I don't come in with my own biases and expect certain things. And I felt like, approaching it that way really helped me gain the trust of a lot of other people within the organization.
Yeah, one of the I hope I just don't like quote books this whole time, but it's okay. That's kind of how I like interface with the world. So, I mean, I am a sales nerd, right? So one of the on your point about other people's perceptions, it's kind of like sales, right? Like you walk into a call and like they're going to have certain perceptions about your solution space or whatever. And so, there's pre-handling objections. Are like, oh, Mr. Customer, I know what you're probably thinking right now. And one of the places where I that kind of opened my eyes to the notion of like management and leadership as just, you know, a sales, you know, engaged in the function of sales, but internally, was Corey Bray's book, 5 Secrets of the Sales Coach. It's quite good. It's written as a narrative, a fable. It's very readable. It's like page turner. We give it to, we give it to sales managers, but he kind of like breaks it out as like a discovery process with the reps, like elucidating to the reps the downside of like, hey, if you don't change, like, you know, why change, why now, all those sort of things, but doing that with respect to management as opposed to doing it with respect to a prospect. And I think that that can be expanded more broadly as well to different parts of the organization as well, right? Like the reason why this is in it for you, Mr. VP of marketing or Ms. VP of sales, is because of X, Y, Z, and this is why. Like these are the negative consequences associated with not changing. These are the positive outcomes potentially associated with that, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So well, I want to change gears a little bit and talk about, I forget who it was. Oh, it was Dylan actually was talking about enablement and like I addressed like detecting the critical path, right? Like the thing that is the constraint in like the revenue, the revenue factory, and then fixing that. And so I think you were talking about, Dylan, like the notion of enablement outside of just like sales or just outside of success and kind of detecting that. One thing I was going to ask folks kind of more broadly is like, when you're thinking about enablement, and we can only like, you know, deal with so many things at once, because if we deal with too many things, then none of it gets done and, you know, don't actually get the ball across the end zone. So one, how do you detect what is the critical path in like what is actually the constraint in your organization, and then and there are going to be lots of constraints, right? But like we can only probably choose a couple. So like how do you detect those constraints, and then how do you like rank them and choose the one that you're going to like honey badger this quarter, right? Or like maybe it's a 2 quarter thing. Dylan, since you kind of mentioned this earlier, as relates to something that was top of mind for you, maybe you can kind of share your approach there with respect to like identifying those constraints, ranking them, and then saying, hey, these are the ones that we're going to work on here.
Yeah, I think I stole the enablement term from Leander, but I think what's key on this is data. And I think this is where, like, not to get super technical, I think how you have your sales cycle or your sales stages set up in Salesforce and sort of how you're monitoring that from like first contact all the way through renewal or upsell is really important, because how you cut those stages is really going to dictate what kind of data you're getting. And if you have the wrong stages or looking at the wrong data, you're going to get like the wrong answers. And so I totally, not to continue to repeat everything Leander says, but I agree. It's all about sort of the buying process and the customer journey that they go through. And if you organize around that, it's a lot easier to understand sort of, you know, where is your biggest bottleneck right now, and then dive into that. I think in terms of prioritization, it's really tough. I think you always have 10 sort of priorities, but I think
it's a little baby bird mouths going like this around you.
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to say like intuition will tell you, but I think usually in my experience, there are one or two that are like the lights are bigger and brighter than sort of some of the others. And so, but I think it's really all about how you let that data drive sort of where you're spending your time and where you feel like you'll have the biggest impact.
Yeah, and I think I can kind of speak a little bit to like, you know, proper stage things, because like this is literally what we spend a lot of time doing here in HM. So, you know, one subsection of like the out of the box metrics that HM has is around stages, right? Like how many like ops meeting certain stages, and also pipeline meeting certain stages and what have you. And oftentimes, what organizations will find is, so first of all, if you're not instrumenting how many ops are making it to a certain stage, and then how much pipe is being moved along the assembly line. Again, another book for everyone, The Goal, right? Like if you want to learn about like, you know, manufacturing and operations research, but written as like a juicy novel about like a in the 80s, because who wouldn't? The Goal is absolutely fantastic, but it really is like we're all in these like revenue factories, right? And they're just like Lucy and Ethel on the assembly line with the chocolates, right? And things are moving along. And so the way that you have to instrument whether or not the chocolates are moving along or if they're falling off the assembly line is really at those stages. And so it's not just ops hitting the stage, it's also the pipe that's hitting the stage, like all the ops that have made it to that stage. And so that's the first like mindset that you should be thinking about, because if you don't, and if you're not measuring that, like you're only measuring what comes in the factory and then what exits the factory, then you lose all this in the between. And then the next thing would be that Dylan points out is, okay, well, you might, if you don't actually have those waypoints on the assembly line, you potentially like, okay, well, like we instrument here when it comes in the factory and then here, and then we have this big gap, and then we have like propose, or like we have contract out and then close one. Okay, like what happens in this messy middle? And so oftentimes where you can kind of see a place where like maybe you need like more granular instrumentation is if you have a particular stage that there were like the time in stage, even the average time in stage is quite long, right? And because like it's like, oh, okay, there's a place in the assembly line where we don't have any cameras. Oopsie. So that can be a very kind of like a very helpful thing there. So Leander, do you want to kind of comment on how you like to detect where like the biggest critical paths are in like the sales motion or the revenue factory, and then again, like, you know, prioritization there as well?
Yeah, I completely agree with Dylan. I think you have to really understand the data and the information to be able to detect what the problem is. And I am always looking for the symptom versus the root. And so a lot of times when you're looking at each of those stages, it's like something isn't working. The problem is there's not enough in the top and there's not enough in the bottom. And so people can tend to just like throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. When you really understand, if you're looking at stage by stage, you're trying to uncover what's really behind it of what the data is that isn't working. And sometimes, yes, it's a sales training problem, or you can work on your skill set, but other times you've got a pricing and packaging problem, or you've got a messaging problem, or you've got a technical blocker that's really not allowing things to progress. And so really looking to what's behind the data, to what's happening. And then I always ask for rep feedback, because there's the science and then there's the art. And so that rep feedback, they can usually give you what's emotional for them on like the one thing they hate the most. And so that's why you got to balance it out with the data, but then really understanding the intuition a little bit more to add color to the data, to make sure that the data is correct. Because we all know what it's like when you start to anchor on the data and then you recognize the data is dirty, or it's maybe not as accurate. Maybe you're making different decisions based off some of the signals that really aren't what's happening in the field. And so circling back around to get validation through the rep's intuition.
Yeah, for sure. And then you can get like, you can do a vibe check. See, I have 20 somethings that work in my organization. You can do a check, and then you can then take that and then more muscularly model the data using that. So I'll give you a good example of this. So one of the things that our success function will do with customers is they really make sure that close loss reasons is mapped as a custom field in Atrium. And so invariably one of the very first things that like an insight that will come out along with pipe hygiene, like, you know, people turn on Atrium account, they see like all these untouched ops and stuck ops, and they're like, oh my God, Jesus. Another one is the proportion of closed loss ops that have no closed loss reason disposition. And like literally, so like you'll see the charts, there'll be like bar charts, and then there's like this big gray bucket in each one. There's all these like tiny like colored slides, and there's a big gray one, it's like unspecified, and people are like, oh man. Right. So then you're like, okay, cool. If we're going to actually answer questions here around, you know, why we're actually losing things, for instance, or why we're losing things from this stage, we probably should have that modeled versus like, oh, hey, well, we don't have the right closed loss reasons. It's like, hey guys, first and foremost, maybe we should actually disposition them. Mike, how do you kind of like to identify the constraint in kind of the workflow at impact.com?
Yeah, so a few different things. So just echoing a couple of things from Leandra and Dylan on the data and the root cause of the issues. You know, one thing I would highlight is, you know, you mentioned things getting jammed up in a certain stage. actually seeing our problem was 2 stages before that and not executing that well. And so really making sure that we're kind of thinking through, okay, why is a certain thing happening? We run an OKR process, measure what matters. And so in that process, we do the same thing where we are getting feedback from the team around the things that we're seeing to complement everything that we're also seeing in our data to formulate our overall strategy. The thing I would add that I find the hardest is the strategic component to it. As you're looking 3 years out, not everyone else is. And so there are times where generally you're going against, whatever that data is that you're seeing for today, because you believe that you've done enough research to understand where that puck is going to be and needing to make some changes around strategy to make sure that the organization gets to that place. And that's a component that's, art and science. And sometimes you just have to make some bets.
True. So we talked about constraints, or like detecting the constraints. So now I want to talk a little bit about like changing things, right? Because that's what we do, right? Like another book, right? The Boyd, the OODA loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, act, and then loop back again. We detected something's wrong. We form hypotheses around like why it might be the case, prescribe some sort of solution to that, and then ideally fix it and come back and like and observe whether or not it changed. So then how do we actually put that into practice? And I think that was something that Dylan was talking about in terms of enablement, was saying, hey, we gotta, like, the constraint might be in some place that other than AE land, for instance. So then the next thing we would say is like, okay, once we've identified the constraint, how do we then deploy that kind of change? And I think that this is a really big thing where when you go from being a first level manager, even a second level manager, to being third level, and say maybe you've got, I think actually I know the Apollo folks pretty well, like, I don't know, 8 frontline managers, or maybe you got like 10 frontline managers or whatever. The joke that we like to say here at Atrium is, as organizations get bigger, the cats that you have to herd change, right? Like when you're a manager, you herd these cats, right? And then when you go up a level, now you got to herd the managers, who then of course herd the hamsters, I guess, or something. I don't know, in this metaphor. So then how do you herd the managers and work through them to then facilitate whatever that change might have been? Leander, maybe we can kind of talk, because I met, like, Intercom was a very large sales organization, if I recall correctly. I mean, obviously Twilio's like not small either, but like you were queen bee at Intercom. Yeah, like, change management and like, turn, it's less about turning a battleship, and it's more about like turning like 1,000 little kayakers. How would you go about doing that at Intercom? Like, what are your best practices around, like, working through your managers and kind of focus and repeating things and so on and so forth?
Yeah, it's such an important topic because we're all humans. And especially, when you have to go through change, there can be a lot of resistance and there can be some questions. And the first thing I like to really educate all of my sales managers is, if you think about a bell curve, the bell curve of change, when we all start that and then we understand it and we solution it, we're on the other side. And your whole entire team is starting from the beginning. And so how do you get them over that hump to where you are as quickly as possible with hopefully as least amount of damage? But really it comes down to, one, communication. So understanding what's happening, why it's happening, and what we're going to do about it. I think sometimes when we're running fast, we can forget the why, and we just are telling them what to do. But we want them to feel ownership in understanding and being able to apply the change that we want to make, and knowing that we're doing it together and we're thinking about all these different scenarios, that this might happen, we're going to make this change, we're going to monitor it, we're going to get back together, and knowing that a lot of times it's either a one-way door or a two-way door. So one-way door, when you make a change and you go in, you can't come back out. And other times you've got that fluidity and flexibility. So when do we know that we're going to try something and then come back out if it doesn't work? Or when do we have to really be thoughtful, sequence the change, make sure the reps have enough time to understand it, embody it, and then execute it in a way that feels good on their change curve, so we're all at the other side together.
Yeah, I went through this recently. That's the way that I phrase that is, like, oftentimes leadership, or like especially founders or like the board, kind of like live in the future. And so if you don't remember that other folks, like, they're maybe 3 months behind you, and you don't like bring them forward, through internal selling,
Yeah.
then you're kind of being like a bad spot there. Like in our case, whatever it was like a year ago when like the SaaS kind of like recession really started to tighten up, and of course we started as founders and at the board level, everyone starts like started seeing things, started puckering up, et cetera, but then like your staff, I think sales organizations maybe saw a little bit too, because they saw the leading indicators of like, whoa, we're closing a lot more from Disco. This is weird, but still, right? Like they lived a little bit more in the past, and so if you don't bring them along, then you're going to be kind of in a tough spot there. Mike, what would you kind of add to that regarding that change management and how you facilitate that?
Sure. Yeah, a couple different things. The stage that the company is in, I found has really mattered. Obviously, when we were less than 50 people compared to 1,000 people, thinking about the frequency of change was really important. At this point, less is more, right? And so we're really thinking through, there's a million things we could change, prioritizing the ones we want to focus on, and then making sure as we're implementing those changes that we are seeing it from beginning to the end with the right measurement components to know the effectiveness. And that's very different than many years ago, where we had that two-way door more frequently that Leandro was mentioning, where we try something, pivot, go back, and go a million different directions.
Yeah. Dylan, anything you wanted to add there on change management and facilitating these changes once they've been detected?
Yeah, and just two quick things. I mean, I think getting alignment, the CRO sort of has an opportunity to kind of take that customer centric view and sort of the customer experience throughout the company. I think it's part of the way to be most sort of impactful. No one wants to be the revenue prevention department, right? And so I think being able to help folks like put the customer experience into terms that they understand for the piece of the cycle or the customer experience that they're responsible for, I think I at least have found it more effective to sort of put this in relatable terms for them and bring them in, sort of recruit them rather than beat them. But I think seeing that customer experience and how they can impact that will tend to sort of help bring folks on board.
Yeah. One thing I want to double click on as relates to enablement, it's a special subgenre of enablement and like getting things done, is this is something that we kind of identified as, so like Atrium's ICP customer, maybe like three or 4 years ago when the product was more basic, was really these like 10, 20 person sales organizations. And then one of the things that we realized in the last 18 months, in part, as relates to the kind of the economic environment, was larger organizations really have a pain point around consistency. And it kind of goes to the like herding the cats thing. This is like an insight that we had about like 18 months ago, like making sure that in our case, it's like making sure that managers are managing consistently, like consistent managerial play. But like we do one-on-ones like this, we do pipeline reviews like this, we do like team meetings like this. But really what it comes down to is it's like working through your managers and making sure that like, and so I think the thing that I would ask folks around is like, how do you think about manager enablement? And like, I kind of hate the word empowerment. Don't tell anyone, especially the 300 people are here, because people think of empowerment as like, all right, go for it, go with God, have fun, versus like, hey, like here's our hymnal, right? Like we're gonna like here's the recipe, right? Like go ahead and like we know that this makes delicious cheesecake. I would like you to make it, and then like I'm gonna taste it, and then like let's do it a couple more times. Like that's a version of empowerment. And then like cool, once you nail that cheesecake, now you can start doing variations on a theme there. But a lot of organizations don't like empower their managers as uniformly as that, and then like they're shocked when you have like managers doing artisanal cheese, like different types of cheesecake all across the organization. And so I guess what my question would be to you all would be, how do you think about that kind of like consistency and like manager enablement, both from like an operating rhythm standpoint, which is just like kind of like keep the lights on, et cetera, but then also for these like special things, these like one-off things that we're talking about, like we're really going to focus on this ICP, or we're really focus on not selling like bad deals or what have you. Leander, maybe we can kind of start with you as relates to, this like consistent manager enablement. How do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges that cuts managers' capabilities off at the knees is changes in an organization that are all rolled out flat at the same time. I'm a big believer in cascading comms. And so making sure that the managers understand first before you roll it out to the rest of the company and the teams, so they can actually get their questions answered, so they can get deeper into the understanding of the managers are confused and the reps are confused. That's when you get 1,000 different types of cheese.
Right. And where organizations always screw that up? Comp plans. Which is like the worst possible situation. It's like, ta-da, here's the comp plan. And the reps are like, hey, boss, blah, 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 blah. Like, I don't know, I just saw this too. I think that, yeah, so like essentially a cascaded comm, right? Cascaded comms, like going to the directors or going to the VPs and then going to the directors and then getting getting the Q&A there. Yeah, I guess it's like, again, selling, but in this case, it's not just like a deal, it's like a campaign that we are running that has like messaging associated with it, and then kind of like, different vectors, etc. Mike, what would you add to that as relates to manager enablement, etc.?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations think about enablement, and you're right, they think about the frontline contributors. How are we, having them speak about the product, the offering, et cetera. And so one thing we've really had to take a step back on is how are we training and engaging our managers across the board so that we get consistency across everything, one-on-ones, team meetings, how they're engaging and handling personnel issues in addition to the more tactical things that you would expect from a sales manager.
Yeah, and then Dylan, how would you add to this?
I would say two things. One, I think it depends on the stage of the company you're in. Michael pointed this out earlier. I think if you're early stage versus late stage, how you approach this is very different. I think for me, the agreement across the team and just sort of the transparency on what metrics you're measuring, what are the metrics that matter, and then how are we going to measure them, then it's a little easier to sort of provide a flexible playbook that managers can still put their own style and sort of, what works for them into play, but also kind of follow what you need to get done and be reporting the right metrics with their team.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny. Our AEs can kind of like smell an organization that has like just gotten past the point at which they should have done that, and they haven't yet. And then they're just like, yeah, because then they're like, oh man, you've got 8 managers or 10 managers, and like you don't have consistency around how you're goaling from an inputs and intermediaries. And like everybody knows that they need to hit this, but like everyone's like figuring out the mechanisms by which to do that. I think the one thing that we didn't touch on too much here, like we talked about like the operating rhythm thing, which obviously is like keeping the lights on, really important. But then there's like the changing pieces as well. I think Leander, you kind of touched on this as relates to like a cascading campaign. I think this is why when I think of, like, we see this a lot with the operations and enablement folks, and this is actually like a theme that we're seeing across our customers right now, where those roles are kind of like merging. Like there's a woman named Sarah Eklund who is the VP of Revenue Operations and Enablement at Staffbase. She just kind of moved from enablement into operations. The merge of those two, and then Kelly Jarrett, who had that role at Gainsight. And I think the reason why is because in order to then change behaviors, managerial behaviors, rep behaviors, et cetera, you need to know what the truth is and like how things are going up, which of course, like the way that we do that is with like data, what have you. But one thing that I hear a lot from our customers is like, you can't do too many things at once. You got to like choose one, especially if you're going to do it in like a thoughtful way, like Leander was saying, where it's like, hey, every week here's a new campaign. Here, I hope you like knew I hope you got on board with the last one. When you guys think about deploying a change, and Leander kind of touched on this already. How do you kind of think about that, across your teams? Dylan, maybe we can kind of like, get your take on that.
I mean, I think the biggest thing, at least the sort of maybe one of the big lessons I've had over the past couple of years, is just you need to prep your team that change is going to be constant, not every week, right?
Sure.
You can't do a new campaign every week, but even if you're in sort of a more established sort of mature company, you're still going to change things. I mean, you look at like Salesforce reorganizes territories and comp plans on a pretty regular basis, right? And they're pretty big. And so I think for me, it's more about just getting the team used to the methodology that you got to be flexible. This is what we're doing now. As market conditions change or the team changes, we're going to make changes. And I think that flexibility is really important. The other thing I would say is I'd never heard the sort of two-way and one-way door. I think for me, it's also about when you're making these changes, giving yourself at least a little bit of wiggle room. It's not to say that you're not going to commit, but I think the notion that you're going to get it 100% right every time is probably off, maybe just for me. But I think giving yourself some flexibility to think like, okay, you're probably going to get the 70 or 80% right. And then let's give ourselves the flexibility to be able to change and adapt as market conditions change or we make mistakes.
Nice. Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, two things. So, on the why and the selling component, and so making sure that you're really thinking through that, and you're selling internally so that everyone gets bought into it. And then the other thing that I would highlight is just the amount of time that it takes for the change to actually take hold, and just overestimating that.
Yes, and repeating things. And then repeating it again.
And again.
Yes. One more time, just in case.
And then, just for kicks, right? Like, if your tongue has not fallen out of your mouth and like rolling around the conference room floor, then you still probably have not repeated yourself enough there. Wonderful. Elliot, looks like you're here to kick us out. Thank you.
I am. Thank you so much to everyone for attending this event. Thank you to Atrium for sponsoring today's panel. Make sure to check them out and all the goodies that they're offering. Those links are in the chat. Thank you again to our panelists for joining us and providing this great content. Recording and key takeaways are going to be available on our page shortly. Don't forget to check out our upcoming events, and we'll see you guys next time. Take care, everybody.
Cool. Thank you very much, guys. Take care.
Thank you.